Alright, so after doing all the cross-cutting on the SawStop saw, which by the way worked out really well with the little cross-cut sled, I started laying out the grid work. Now, none of these parts are glued in yet except for the perimeter pieces. I went ahead and glued down the perimeter pieces, clamped them down to get them down flush to the edge, and let those dry. That's going to be sort of like my guidelines. Then I cut the pieces to length that are going to run this way in the torsion box. Like I said, none of these are glued down yet, but they're in there so you can get an idea of what it's going to look like. Then I cut all of my 5 9/16 inch short pieces for the grid. It's going to take 27 of those. I cut a few extra just because I was enjoying cross-cutting on the SawStop. Then I worked out, using similar math to what we used before, the spacing for the spacers going this way. And what I decided to do was to start short on this end, and then long, short, and then all long spaces, then again short, long, short, so that the grid is offset. That gives it a lot of structural integrity, but it also makes it easy to get into either side and nail these down as I'm applying the glue. Going to be using an 18 gauge nailer here, and I'm using 1 3/8 inch nails. Normally you'd probably want to use 1.5 inches, but because it's going to be a little tight in here, I don't want the nails poking through. So I just want to use a little bit shorter nail. They're just there to hold it while the glue is drying. Going to be using Titebond Extend glue just to give me a little bit more time while I'm working on this. And I also like the consistency of the Extend glue. It's a little bit thinner than the Titebond 3. So we're pretty much ready to go. Start putting this together. Lots of people get really frustrated putting together a torsion box, but there's no need for stress. The first and most important thing is to start with a perfectly level and flat surface. And I don't want to belabor the point, but start with a perfectly level and flat surface. Whatever the width of the grid pieces, rip plenty of stock. Do it all at one time. I always stand the grid pieces on edge next to each other and just check with my fingers to make sure they're all exactly the same height. Then work out what your grid pattern is going to be. A little math is all that takes. Measure carefully and cut the grid pieces to length. Work out the spacing between the grid pieces and cut spacers to size. When I need 2 spacers, I like to stack them and cut them at the same time. That way they're exactly the same length. All that's left to do at that point is start assembling. You'll notice I'm slopping the glue on pretty heavy. No one will ever see the inside of a torsion box, so drips and squeeze out are really not a concern. One note though, in the small square and rectangle formed at the corners of the torsion box where we drew in the location of the pedestal supports, clean up any squeeze out there. You'll see why in a few minutes. Alright, we've started at this end and came all the way across, and now we're at the other end, and as expected, because of variations in the thickness of the plywood and my calculations, these are long by, it looks like, about 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to mark this, and I'm going to go back to the SawStop and the crosscut sled, and I'm going to nibble off a little bit until I get a perfect fit, and we're ready to put in the last few pieces of spacers. Alright, I've got the last few pieces trimmed to size now. It's just a matter of gluing those into place. In this corner, I have also opted to put in one of the spacer pieces close to the corner because this is where the pedestal support will be. So I'm going to put the short piece here and at the other end as well. The grid work is finished now, and I'm going to let this sit overnight before we attach the piece down here, which is going to be the top. We'll come back tomorrow and finish up the basic construction of the torsion box top. The grid work is dry, ready to go. We're almost ready to put the other piece of MDF up here and complete this torsion box sandwich and basically have the top finished. But there's one more thing I need to do, and that's to make these four corners solid. Basically, this is where the leveling mechanism is going to be, that's going to independently level the top independent of the base assembly. So we want to make it solid wood. Now this dimension here is 2 1/4 inches, so 3 pieces of 3/4 inch solid stock glued in here will be perfect to bring this up to level. So I'm just going to cut the pieces to size. I'll need 12 pieces, 3 in each corner. We'll glue those in place and we're ready to put the top on. Now the spacer that we used to form the small corner pockets in the torsion box was 4 7/8 inches. So I've set the rip fence here to rip a piece 4 7/8 inches. I've got a relatively flat piece of pine wood, and we're ready to make that rip cut. Alright, so using the crosscut sled and a stop block, I cut all of the pieces we ripped a minute ago to length, and so now I have 12 pieces that can be stacked up and glued into those corners. And of course, the thickness of those pieces stacked together is 2 1/4 inches, just exactly the same as our grid pieces. So let's go. Now, before we glue, one last little thing is we drilled these pilot holes through here, these locator holes, and I'm just going to use a really tiny piece of blue tape just to keep the glue from running through that hole. Pour on the glue. We want a good solid fit here. I heard a squish, so I think the glue's made contact. I'm going to glue the next piece in. I'm being sure to get glue around the edges here. Give it structural integrity. And there we go. I'm going to put one clamp on there just to make sure that the pieces of wood stay in tight registration until the glue dries. Do the same thing in all the other 3 corners, and then our solid corner blocks will be ready to go for the adjusting mechanism. I have slid the 3/4 inch piece of MDF out from underneath the torsion box, and I'm ready to slide that over and put it on as the top of this sandwich and sort of finish off the basic construction here. But a couple of things we've got to keep in mind. There's a 1 7/8 inch reveal on 3 sides of the torsion box, and the MDF will be flush here on what will be the front. The question is how to apply glue to this entire grid work, then get the MDF on top, get it positioned with the perfect 1 7/8 inch reveal on 3 sides, without sliding it around so much that we rub off all the glue. Well, a couple of little tricks for that, and the first involves making a couple of homemade temporary clamps. So let's go see how to do that. Okay, I've got a piece of the 3/4 inch MDF, which was just a sawn off scrap from making the top assembly. What I've done is I've just marked off a 17-inch mark here. So I'm just going to cross cut this to length. And I've also got a piece of the 1/2 inch MDF left over, and I've marked off 17 inches here, and I'm going to cross cut that to the same length. Alright, now this piece that I cut 17 inches long was just a smidge over 4 7/8. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take off a tiny little bit here to get it to exactly 4 7/8 inches. Alright, so now I've got this cut-off piece of 3/4 inch MDF, and I've set the rib fence for 3 inches. I'm going to rip this down. Alright, so what I've got here is a 4 7/8 inch piece and a 3-inch piece, which naturally leaves a 1 7/8 inch ledge here. This ledge is going to go under the top to give us our 1 7/8 inch reveal. But first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to glue these two pieces together. Then I'm going to set up and make some screw holes so that we can screw this in. And this is what will clamp down on the top to hold it in place so we get the perfect reveal when we put the top on. But first, let me just dab a little glue in here, clamp it together for a few minutes, and we'll get this piece put together. Okay, so now I've got our little piece here that I've glued together, the 3/4 inch piece. 3/4 inch piece is a spacer here, and all I did was I took the top 1/2 inch piece and I marked off roughly 4-inch segments, and then about 1 1/4 inches from each edge, put some tick marks here for screw holes. And I'm going to drill pilot holes now through this. And I'm just going to line these boards up on the end. And if I don't get all the way through, that's fine. I just want to make sure I get them marked. They don't have to be perfect. Okay, there's our pilot holes drilled in this section. I'm going to just deepen each one of those a little bit. Alright, so for assembling these little clamps, I'm going to use drywall screws. They're 2 inches long. They're basically a number 8 screw. So a clearance hole is 5/32 of an inch for that. I'm just going to put a spacer block underneath that and just turn these first holes into through holes now in this top 1/2 inch piece of MDF. Alright, so now after drilling the pilot holes, I've sliced these into 4 pieces. Each one has 2 clearance holes and pilot holes. And because this is 3/4 inch MDF here with a 1 7/8 inch setback, this will go right up to the edge of the table, and then this is going to clamp down on top to hold it in place. and that'll be what locates the 3 reveal edges of the top of the torsion box. However, since this is exactly the same thickness as the top, all we want to do is just take a sanding block and from about where the screw holes are located out to the edge, just taper it a tiny bit. It only takes a little bit. And you can see what this has done here, so that when these screws tighten down, this will actually be just a smidge narrower than the MDF it's clamping to. So we'll be ready to go here in just a second. And there we go. Sweet. Nothing's going to mar the top, but yet it's clamped on there with a correct reveal back here on the underside. Now we've got the spacer block clamps in position on the top, the 3/4 inch MDF that's going to get glued on here. I've got some 3/8 inch scrap that I just cut, and I'm putting it in here, and the idea is to provide a spacer between the grid and the top until I get it in position and then drop it into place. Kind of like putting dowels under laminate material and then pulling them out and smoothing the laminate material down. So, ready to start pouring the glue to it. Going to glue all these edges. Going to lift the top up, get it in position, pull these pieces out, and it should drop straight down into position. And then I'll just put some weight on it and let it sit overnight until it sets up. That way we'll have no nails in the top that could potentially cause a problem down the road. Okay, we're perfectly flush on this edge, and we've got our reveal lined up out there. Looks like we're in pretty good shape. Okay, just have a little bit of squeeze out to clean up. Well, we slopped the glue on, got the top into position, lightly clamped it around the perimeter, put some weights out here in the center, and I've been checking it with my level, and it's really flat. So I think we're in good shape here, but we still need to do the trim, particularly on this overhanging edge, which is 1 7/8 inches. So we want to do something to support that edge a little bit, and also to protect this edge against dings around the shop, because this is going to get pretty heavy use. But you know, to do that, I'm going to need to use the dado blade in the SawStop. So before we start making the trim for this, we'll set it aside for a little bit and we'll start working on the pedestal bases. After we get all those pieces cut out, we'll switch over to the dado blade, cut the dados for the pedestal base pieces, and cut out this trim. All that's in the next video. I'll look forward to seeing you, and thank you so much for watching this one.